All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Association Chat. This is your online discussion for the association community where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with the topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, Kiki L'Italienne, and I want to welcome all of you who are already logged in live today. I've seen many of some familiar faces or names that are in the chat box already saying hello, and I'm glad to see so many of you on this morning. This is part of a new ongoing series on the essential conversations that leaders need to have during this period of crisis. Needless to say, these are not our typical times. These are very unusual times. And this episode focuses on asking the right questions and specifically getting into the questions that will elicit the most helpful and productive responses so that leaders of organizations can be empowered to better navigate this particular moment in history. Sometimes I get so caught up in my association chat life and the community and the website that I leave out some of my consulting life, which many of you may not realize that that's very active too. And so I get to be a part of some amazing discussions with today's guests who are my colleagues at Tecker International. So with us today, I have the good fortune to introduce Glenn Tecker.
Good morning.
Glenn, good morning. Glenn is widely acknowledged as one of the world's foremost experts on association and nonprofit leadership and strategy. We have Robin Wedewer, who Robin brings 25 years of experience in marketing and market research to client data and competitive challenges with an impressive portfolio of association and corporate clients. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you.
And we have Paul Meyer from facilitation to training, consultation for strategic direction, revenue creation, alliance building, and chapter relations. Paul offers a cohesive and creative approach to the management and development of associations, academic institutions, state governments, medical organizations, and corporations. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. So we got all of that, all the introductions out of the way so that we can get to the heart of the matter, which is talking about these important discussions that we need to be having with our stakeholders today. And, one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of in our industry, people are beginning to ask questions, beginning to get those questions answered, and then putting out reports. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about some of the information that's coming back and how associations can use that. So I want to kick this off by talking a little bit about when we talk about asking questions, we're really talking about research. So Glenn, I'm going to pose this to you, and then everyone understand that you can jump in as we're going along. This is a discussion. But Glenn, why is asking questions so important for associations right now?
Oh, yeah, that's a really basic and important question, and one that is not answered easily with a soundbite. Think first about the context that we're currently in. Context characterized by dramatic, unexpected change, a period of time where there are more unknowns than knowns. We've had situations like this before. And one of the things we have found in previous situations is that associations really have a choice. They have a choice between actively engaging in work that's intended to shape a desirable future for themselves or allowing themselves to become a victim of that future. The challenge, of course, is that the future is the one thing you can never know for sure. Mm-hmm. So what we find are those associations that successfully navigated through those periods of time found the right balance between responding to the immediate issues the change created, but simultaneously taking the time to think about what's coming over the horizon. But since there are so many unknowns, the answer to what's coming over the horizon can be multiple. So strategy becomes more important than ever, except that strategy needs to be developed for alternative scenarios. So what you look for in research are those changes that are occurring that folks believe will continue to occur over the horizon, and then probe those changes to see what needs will be created as a result of that new behavior, and hopefully find within those needs either challenges that'll have to be addressed on behalf of the members, or more likely and perhaps more attractively, opportunities that may exist for the association to be of service that didn't exist within the previous environment. What we're trying to do then is to gather behaviorally based information rather than just opinions of individuals, and to gather it from a wide variety of populations that may have some insight in the changes that are occurring. So research becomes the knowledge-based foundation for consideration of what the possibilities are, as well as consideration of what responses may be most util given that context.
Just to add to that, Kiki, it was interesting. I was looking at a PowerPoint presentation that I gave back in 2010, during the recession, and there was a definition of change leadership that I was using then, and I think is so appropriate today, and really the basis for why we do research, and that is a change leader is somebody who has the ability to focus on putting out the fires right now, but also to be planning for the future. So you've got this interesting sort of balance between putting out the fires and preparing for the future. And right now, as we know, so many of the members of associations are putting out fires. Now, the association is too, but we're all putting out fires right now. And what I've heard members say, please, association, help me plan for the future. Because I'm putting out my fires now, you need to help me plan for the future. And of course, that isn't done in a vacuum. That's done with good, solid research.
It's also one of the places where the needs of different associations become specific to them. When you're putting out fires, we've seen among our clients and other not-for-profits, lots of conversation about, well, what are you doing in response to this issue? What are you doing when your meeting is canceled? What are you doing when you have to deal with revenue streams and their effect on staff salaries? So people tend to be benchmarking themselves against others or borrowing ideas for others to deal with the here and now. But when you're dealing with the future, you cannot really depend upon benchmarking from others. We've for years heard the expression that my association is different, and we've never really seen a problem or an opportunity that in one association that we haven't seen in another. But the reality that Robin and Paul both know as well as I and you is that the combination of those two things is never the same in any association. So when someone says my association is different, they really are. When you look at the diverse impact of the current situation on industries and professions, the degree to which that impact differs from industry to profession also immediately shows up in the association's challenges and opportunities. There are some associations that are confronting enormous growth, and their problem is going to be managing the growth. There are others who may only survive by merging with other organizations to sustain that critical mass. So the research is what allows you to anticipate what the effect of dynamics in your members' environment are going to mean for the work of the association.
Right. So, I was just going to say, so there are so many questions right now. I mean, questions seems to be the thing that we're not lacking. I mean, we might be worried about whether there's toilet paper in the stores, but we're not worried about having questions. We've got those. Robin, because of all of the surveys that are going around, internally we've discussed these. We've talked about why certain types of these surveys are more helpful for association leaders than others. You're one of our research gurus. Can we talk about what makes for a high quality, effective type of research effort versus research that's maybe more superficial and, more of the sort of benchmarking variety?
Thanks, Kiki. I think I've probably responded to about 7 or 8 surveys myself here in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I'm very surprised at some of the questions that I'm seeing in the surveys, because even a couple of those surveys have even been from research organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we all need to go back to basics. Really good research begins with knowing what you want to accomplish with the research. What is your objective with the research, and being very clear on your intentions. And it's only from there that you can start asking, what are the research questions? These are not survey questions, but they're research questions that are going to guide the research. Then you ask yourself, who's going to have the information? And then look at your questions and think, are the questions we're asking things, as Paul mentioned earlier, about people's behaviors? Are they about people's opinions? Or are we asking them about the future? And when we ask people about the future, is it what they're thinking about the future? Is it scenarios about the future? Or are we asking them to predict the future, which is another way of saying guess about the future? And that is exactly the thing that I've seen in a lot of the surveys that I've seen, is that organizations are asking members or customers or whoever to guess what's going to happen. What is the percentage change you expect to see in your sales? Is it going to go up or down? How many customers do you expect to retain? How many customers do you expect to delay? Guess what? Those are all guesses, and it's not useful information. And so I think that the better information is going to be asking questions that are much more difficult to answer in a survey, which suggests that we need to be asking much deeper questions, more qualitative questions, and having meaningful dialogues about what's going on in people's worlds. What does that mean for what they're thinking about their values? What does that mean for what they're planning for the future? What does that mean for how they're going to respond? And there's so much going on. It's like we're driving at night in the fog, and we can't see where we're going. And so because of that, we have to think about all the possible things that can happen. And to me, that is the real opportunity with research right now, is to talk meaningfully and deeply with members about the possibilities that could happen and how they could respond, so that we can start doing scenario planning. And I think that ultimately the research needs to be the fuel for scenario planning, and we all need to become much, much better scenario planners for the future.
Robin has written a great deal on an approach to qualitative research that we refer to as decision-focused research.
Right.
And the rubric for that is applicable in all situations, but particularly important in this period of unknowns. You begin by clarifying what's the decision you want to make, or what's the question you want to answer. Then you ask, what information do you need in order to make that decision or answer that question? Then what will the source of that information be? And then how will we go about collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and reporting those responses? So what Robin is suggesting is really what the question or the decision is: if this, then what?
Yeah, we have a great question that just came in, and I think this is from Lowell. So hey, Lowell, good to see you. So are you hearing that members of organizations are seeking only for the indicators of what future may emerge? Or is there an increased desire by members to grow their individual capacity for foresight, looking to the association to provide training and models that can learn, adopt, adapt?
Yeah, so I'll take that, just to and sort of build off of some experience I've had recently. Just coincidentally, several clients had already planned on doing qualitative research before the pandemic hit, in the sort of March, May, April timeframe. And I've done the research with the March, April groups, and it's been fascinating to see how people are at first a lot of scared. Everybody is like, oh my gosh, I can't think of anything but what I have to do today. But now I think the last set of research I've done, people are starting to get out of it and they're starting to say, okay, we are willing to start thinking about the future. And they are expecting the association to help them do that. So yes, the association has to be really good at better foresight tools. Now, what does that look like? One of the things that I've noticed is, and this goes back to Robin's point about understanding what you're trying to find and who has the information. I've found that the people I've been talking to outside of the traditional member are the ones I'm getting the best information from. So for example, are we willing to have some conversation with our members' customers to identify what their customers are saying? Are we willing to have conversations with economists within our profession or industry? Are we willing to have conversations with consultants in our profession or industry? Are we willing to have conversation with vendors, which we typically don't really ask them? In fact, I just did some research with a bunch of vendors for an association, and those vendors were so happy that somebody was asking them what they thought about the future, because they typically don't get asked. They get asked for money, but they don't get asked for their thoughts about the future. So really thinking through who we're asking and what are we asking them is really important, and don't assume that our members really know at this point. So foresight building is really making sure that we're going outside of our traditional customer base for that information.
And in my work with clients recently, to answer Lowell's question and tie it to Paul's observations, yes, they are interested in building capacity, in creating a culture of a learning community, in embedding within their expectations nimbleness. But what I have discovered is, in many cases, their vision of what that means is a vision that is stereotypical, a vision that is biased by the existing prejudices of the current leadership, or the prejudices of individuals they've been working with for some time, who seek oftentimes, unfortunately, to protect approaches that they've used in the past. So reaching outside of the normal population, who are the sources of that research, becomes essential to developing an understanding of what capacities and what cultural attributes are desirable given what the future may hold. We, for many years, have observed that probably the worst source of insight about members' needs is a board of directors. The second worst source is senior staff. The third worst source are committee chairs and chapter leaders, because they are also intrinsically and already involved in the work of the association, that they share a view driven by information that in many ways is insulated among them. So helping those association leaders reach out of the normal bubble of information that they are spending their time in, we find is one of the absolute necessities of research in this time of unknowns. And Robin, I think you were going to add to that, were you not?
Well, I was. I'm working with a group right now, and we're really designing a project. If you think about it as where you focus your attention, we're thinking about it as a 360-degree process. So at every touch point that the association, whether it's, as you mentioned, the vendors, members, of course, but what about the stakeholder, regulatory, legal, politicians, all of those people, everyone has a different perspective. And it's really important to brainstorm outside of your bubble, as you mentioned, Glenn, and to think about what that whole universe is that is around the association, and to make sure that you're sampling all of it so that you get a very, very clear perspective. It's hard to do because people are really busy right now, and it's hard to get conversations with people. But in order to have a really clear understanding of where the association's position is, where you can possibly go, what you need to consider, you have to take all of those multiple perspectives into account.
I love that. I think that taking in those perspectives, it's so critical. For those who are watching right now, I just want to actually take in your perspective right now. And if you're able to type into the chat box your answer to this question, and that is, what's the number one question you would like to have answered by your stakeholders right now? What is the question that is weighing on you more than anything else? If anyone feels brave to type that in and just share with everyone else, go ahead and do that right now. I saw that there was another question that came in, and it actually ties into the question that I wanted to bring up next. And that is, how do small associations address this research challenge when they are clearly strapped financially? And Reed, thank you for asking that question. What do you say, my wise panelists?
I offer first, don't do a Survey Monkey survey.
Yes.
Don't
Stay
do
away. Stay
Resist
away.
the temptation. I would say the best thing that you can do, pick up the phone and call people. Have conversations. You can spend all day long calling your members, calling people who interact with the association. I would recommend very strongly to have 5 key questions that you really want to cover during your conversations so that you have a meaningful dialogue. But talking to people is where you're really going to get an understanding. It not only gives you the information, but it also conveys to the people who you are trying to serve that you're listening to them. And so, okay, you don't have any money. You don't have to have any money to pick up the phone. So spend your days talking on the phone with people, understanding what's going on with your members. And oh, by the way, when you do that, take copious notes, because what's going to happen is you're going to go away and you're going to remember 3 things they said to you or 2 things they said to you. But if you continue, keep copious notes, review those notes, look at where the connections are between what person A said and person Z said, and start putting those things together. It's like a qualitative project, those conversations. And in order to make sense of it, you have to document it, you have to display it, you have to reorganize it. So getting in the weeds here, but I'll tell you, write observations on Post-it notes and put them on the wall, and start to see where you see trends, and start to see where you see outliers, and start to make sense of what you're hearing from all the people that you're talking with from those very, very deep and meaningful conversations.
The question of fiscal investment in times of scarce resources is an interesting one as it relates to qualitative research. When many folks hear the term qualitative research, the first thing that comes to mind is focus groups, which can be expensive. But as Robin was describing, we find the most cost-effective methodology to ask and get answers to the questions that are needed now are, in fact, personalized telephone interviews. And personalized telephone interviews will be the most cost-effective approach to inquiry of the right type that you can imagine. Broad-based surveys can be extremely expensive, depending upon who and how you engage in the telephone interviews. It costs a lot less than big written omnibus survey, and it gives you more. So if it costs less and gives you more, by definition, that's what cost effectiveness is about. The question that you have to ask is, to what extent can you make confident decisions without the insights that kind of research provides? And Paul, I think you were going to add something to Robin's observations.
Well, I would just add 2 things. One is, I did research yesterday with a client, and people were saying, "Oh, I'm so glad it's not a Zoom call. It's an audio call. I can relax. I can go outside. I can look out my window. I don't have to stare at my screen." So, your members will be pleased that they don't have to get on a Zoom call with you. So do an audio call so that you can just listen to what they're saying as opposed to trying to do Zoom. That's one thing I've learned. The other thing, too, is that now, Robin, close your ears because I know you're a pure researcher. But I found that, I don't have to talk to too many people in a population to start hearing the same thing over and over again. Don't think that you have to have a legitimate sample to really know strategically what's going on. If you're talking to, well, Robin, close your ears.
I know, Robin.
If you're talking to 5 people. I found that just talking to 5 people in any stakeholder group, I'm starting to hear the same thing over and over again. So you don't have to go to huge samples unless you're publishing. I mean, if you're publishing, that's a whole different story. But if you're just trying to make decisions based on research that are strategic in nature, and you don't have to worry about publishing, you don't have to go to that many people. Now, be careful about 1 or 2, but at least go to sort of 5 in a sample, and then you're going to start hearing the same things.
Yeah, and what may be, in fact, more important than the number
Sorry, Robin.
are which minds you ask to engage in the conversation with you. You're looking for your brightest, those who have a kind of experience that others might not have, folks who can shape an idea and effectively articulate it. In qualitative research, you are not statistically encumbered by reliability and validity coefficients or standards of deviation. What you're looking to do is to come to understand relationships and patterns. And as Paul suggested, to develop a window of insight into relationships and patterns doesn't require asking 100 people. Robin will also tell you that it's not uncommon for qualitative and quantitative research to be used in combination, where qualitative can be used to identify what you want to find out more about. So if qualitative suggests that here's a reality that most folks believe they will be living in the future, then you might want to test the degree to which that view is shared by a larger population with quantitative. But it may be my own personal prejudice. I always prefer to begin with qualitative rather than begin with quantitative.
I would add.
Go ahead, Robin.
I would add too that if you're only going to talk to 5 people, make sure it's not the same 5 people you always talk to. And then also that there are 5 very different type of people. Almost every association that we work with has different types of members. They're in different segments. They have different work settings. They have different experiences. They have different roles within the industry, for example. And it's really important to make sure that we sample all of those. So, it might not be 5, it might be 5 and 5 and 5 and 5.
Right.
A lot more than 5. And so to make sure, again, that 360-degree perspective is taken into consideration. I think that's hard to do with 5. But
yeah, no, I was saying 5 from each stakeholder group. Okay, so you've got a sample of 25 to 30, 5 from each group.
Okay, I'll buy that.
One of the keys here is being clear on what the significant variables are that you're going to use to determine which groups you're going to find 5 people from. We define a significant variable as a characteristic or a value set that allows you to define and predict where the interest, needs, or experience of one group would be different than the interest, needs, and experience of another group that did not exhibit the same value set. So it's important not to depend, we have found, on the traditional demographic variables that are actually stereotypes masquerading as segments to identify who you want to talk to. Now, what I mean by that is if I say to you, because you have this characteristic, you belong in this group, that's a stereotype. If I say to you, because you believe or behave this way, you go in this group, that's a segment. It's the difference between demographics and psychodemographics or value graphics. So if you're looking to see where there are patterns across groups with different conditions and different experiences that can then be generalized up to something sufficiently common for the association to then create a response to, you need to be very careful that you get a sufficiently diverse set of individuals where commonality among them has real significant meaning.
I have to just insert here that if you're following along with Association Chat and you want to do a little extra homework or review some interviews that we've done in the past, David Allison is the name of an expert that I've had on who's become a good friend, and he is the author of a book that has to do with value graphics. He has sort of a reprisal of that book that's coming out soon. But David, Allison, if you want to go back and check out that interview, it's really fantastic to find out more about what Glenn was just talking about. And I want to take this opportunity to transition into talking a little bit more about how to ask those questions, because we've talked about who we're talking to and the types of questions, but how to ask those questions is also important. And Trish asked a really wonderful question here. Can you offer tips on how to avoid your own bias and how you probe further as you continue interviewing one member after another?
Yes, I can offer some suggestions on that. One of the biggest mistakes that I see when I observe people who are not experienced researchers is they do a lot more talking than they need to do. They explain their worldview and then they ask someone to respond to it. The best thing you can do is, like I mentioned earlier, is to have your 5 questions, be brief in your introduction about those questions, say you really want to listen, and then actually listen. And don't take this as an opportunity to inform the people you're talking with about all the great things your association is doing and all the things you planned and all of that, but to really listen with an open mind and an open heart to what they're saying. And then when you're finished with that, I think that you can't always forget when you go on to the next conversation. And I think there's a lot to be gained when you take the learnings from one conversation into the next. But first, get the other person to give their responses to questions, and then say some of the things I have heard are, and then you get them to respond to what other people have had to say. So you will continue to build on what you have learned. But again, be prepared with your questions. Stop talking and listen. Take notes. Be prepared to build on what you've already learned by asking follow-up questions to the subsequent people that you've talked with.
And I would add to that, our colleague Jeffrey Kafad has been very graciously sharing with our common community the kinds of questions that elicit response as free from bias as possible. You'll never fully eliminate it because what you choose to ask about is itself a bit of a bias. But we have found there are 3 probing questions that are very simple, and most of the other questions are one way or another a manifestation or extension of those 3 questions. One is why. The second is what's serving as the basis of that observation. And the third is, can you give me an example of that? So what you're doing in probing is you're asking for further description of the thinking that is behind whatever statement has been made. And Paul, I think that's been the experience that all of us are having in our interviews, is it not?
Sure. And just, I want to go back real quickly to this idea of bias, because I think it's a very interesting one and a very important one to address. And that is, what one project I did with a group was, the association couldn't afford to have outside people do the telephone interviews, so they had to do internally. And what we did was we avoided, say, for example, the education manager talking about education. We avoided the advocacy person talking about advocacy, just because we knew that they were going to have a bias. So potentially use a staff person that's not necessarily associated with that program line to do some of the research, if you don't have a researcher, obviously, in order to kind of avoid that sort of bias that could creep in.
So Keith had actually responded with a question earlier. We had asked a question, I had asked a question. So what's your number 1 question right now? Type it into the chat. And Keith was brave enough to share his. And it's, what's the 1 or 2 things that we can provide you right now to help make sure your hospital will remain open or functioning during and after this pandemic? What
That's
do you
an
think?
easy question with an easy answer. Money. What else is
Right.
Yeah, he says, Kiki knows I'm not shy. I do. That's why I felt like I could share it. Thank you, Keith. Yeah, it's definitely something where we want to, as Trish was saying, avoid the hammer and nail phenomenon. We don't want to go into asking questions where we assume we already have the answers, right? And we're seeking confirmation for what we think we already know. It's very difficult to do that. But Robin, her advice about your advice, Robin, about just stop talking and listening is good advice in a lot of situations. I could take that advice in a lot of different situations too. So as we're talking about conducting these interviews and doing research, what are some things? I know that all of us have been doing research like this lately. Paul, you were sharing some things that you had been surprised about from some of the interviews that you've been doing. What were you maybe most surprised about recently? I guess as we were, because you were in the middle of doing these research projects as this pandemic was announced, and then everything's been unfolding since. So priorities maybe going into it, have they shifted for some of these projects? Have you been found that you've needed to change your approach as you've been making these calls?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, things have changed. And, I was looking back at a research report I put together 3 weeks ago for a client that was right at the edge of it. And even what we're talking about today is different than 3 weeks ago. So it is shifting. However, a couple of things, observations I would make. One is, without a doubt, every person I've talked to, and I've talked to probably almost 100 people, they've thanked me afterwards and thanked the association for asking. Because we tend to forget that a simple 30-minute conversation with a member could be your renewal for the reason why they're going to join the next year, because you've asked them something, and you've asked them in a way that is not just a SurveyMonkey poll that's come out that is a bother to them, rather than an opportunity to really sit back for a minute, take a break from their chaotic life, and just have a conversation with somebody about the future. So I have been surprised with how many people are willing, even for 30 minutes, but because they see this as so important for the future, they're willing to give their time. So that's one thing. Don't believe that people aren't willing to give you 30 minutes of their time. It may be on the weekend, it may be in the evening, and you got to be willing to talk to people at odd hours, but they are willing to give you their time. Secondly, what's different about now versus research I've done in the past is the personal net. The people are very concerned about their personal lives, and that's that balance between the two is really impacting people greatly. So just be cautious about that and be sensitive to that. If you've got people in the background making noises, whatever, just be sensitive to what's going on. And then the third thing I would say is the idea of having conversation about the here and now, because you got to get over that hump. You can't ignore what's going on today, but really spend your time really thinking about what does this mean for the future, because now people are willing to start thinking that way. A week or 3 weeks ago, a month ago, they weren't. Okay, but now we're right at the cusp of when people are starting to think about, for example, I was just doing research with an educational organization. They're starting to think about September. They've responded directly to what they need to do now to get through this semester, but now they're starting to think about September. So what is every other industry's and professions September? When can we start kicking in again, where we've got to be different, whether it's January 1, whether it's September 1, whenever it is, we gotta get out of this and move on. So, the real question that people are eager to ask is, what will that look like? And then the association needs to then ask the follow-up question, what role do we play? Are we going to play a role to create opportunities for our members, or are we going to be a role to fight for something that they want it to go back to? In other words, the difference between going back to what we think it should be and moving on to something else. Both of them are extremely important for the association.
So if I can, let me tie Paul's first and last point to Keith's question. It may be that the individual he's talking to really doesn't know what the answer is. And the gift that Keith can give him is the methodology that he uses to help him think through what the answer ought to be. That is, what is the experience you're having at the moment that's different than before? Of that experience, what do you expect to continue into the future? And where do you expect to return to the way things were before? In those areas where you expect things to be different in the future, what then are the opportunities that exist for your hospital? And if finance is the issue, what are the opportunities in terms of new revenue streams? If staffing is the issue, what are the opportunities in terms of staffing? So as the association is gathering the information from from individuals, it is also giving them, and I'll call it a gift, of a way of thinking strategically about the questions that they themselves don't have answers yet. At the same time that they're using the answers that they're receiving to shape a response from the association itself.
I'll add another one, Glenn, and that is in reflecting when you're talking with people, one of the most powerful questions I found is asking people to think about how they've gotten to this point. What are the lessons that you've learned from your preparedness or your not being prepared from this experience that will make a difference for how you plan for the future? So while we're in the midst of it, to think about the lessons that we're learning and what are the implications for those lessons for how we prepare for the future, not only one future, but many potential scenarios for the future. And to really start thinking in a reflective way, looking at the past, but then what does that mean for the future?
Yeah. The scenario planning piece, Robin, is so important, and the example I would give is how, working with one organization in the healthcare arena, and obviously the big question in healthcare is telemedicine, what will it look like in the future? So, the scenario would be, what if telemedicine becomes common? Okay. It's not about, and then what if telemedicine becomes common? What does that mean for how our members' world will change? Then what's the role of the association in responding to that new world? So it's sort of this three-part process of what is going on out there? What if this happens? What then is the impact on our members? And then what is the role of the association in response? And that role of the association could be reacting to a challenge that telemedicine could bring, or it could be creating an opportunity that telemedicine should bring. So the idea would be is, we tend as associations to kind of react to things that are negative. Oh no, something's happening out there. We got to react because our members expect us to react. But finding the right balance for the association in the future between reacting to what's going on and shaping the future is going to be very, very important in the next 6 to 8 months.
So I would add two additional related words to it. And those words are, will you serve or will you lead? And that's a role choice that associations have always had. In this period of time, perhaps more than periods of time I can remember over the last 50 years, the way that you serve best is to lead. So the distinction between the two has now become a porous membrane instead of a forced choice. It's Peter Senge's notion of the power of the and versus the tyranny of the or. The best way to serve in times of change and unknowns is to lead. And that's where research provides the foundation for an intelligent approach to leadership.
So that is a phenomenal place to ask my next question, because when we are looking at taking that leadership role and we are looking at knowledge-based, informed decision-making, I want to ask you, and this was going to be my final question, but actually it's going to lead into more discussion. I want to ask you what the top 3 questions you think that every association leader should be asking their members and volunteer leaders rather than but what they should be asking right now.
And other stakeholders who were involved in the industry, who may not necessarily even be eligible for membership.
Yes. So does anyone feel like they have their 3 ready to go? I know I didn't give you much time to think about it.
While everyone thinks about it, the challenge to the question that you asked is that the top 3 may differ from situation to situation, from organization to organization. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about general lines of inquiry, I think then there are 3 to 6 that at one point or another need to be asked. Paul, what were you thinking?
Oh, I'm with you. Although I would definitely agree with what Keith was saying, where you've got to respond to the here and now. So you've got to start with the here and now, because if you don't start there, it's going to come up in the conversation later. So you want to kind of get that out in the open. And then once you get that out in the open, then the follow-up. So the question is, what are the 1 or 2 things that you're dealing with right now? So to me, the follow-up question is then, what do you think is going to be permanent? In other words, if this is what you're dealing with today, what do you think is going to be permanent in our industry or profession in the future? And what do you think will not? So what do you think is going to stick and what's not going to stick? Mm-hmm. And then once you identify what you think is going to stick, well, then what kind of challenges and opportunities does that create? And what does that mean for workforce, for technology, for competition, for economics? And then you kind of go through all the different elements of what your members are facing. Then the follow-up question is, okay, so what? The association, what can the association do about it that you can't do yourself? So what are those unique things the association, because of its mission and its values and what it does, can do uniquely for you in the area of advocacy, in the area of education, in the area of connection? So it's then that follow-up question about the role of the association. Recognizing the association doesn't have the ability to respond to everything, and they shouldn't. They're uniquely focused or uniquely positioned to focus on certain things.
We have traditionally counseled associations to ask 3 what are now almost classic questions that over the course of time have proven to be windows into the development of the kinds of insights that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Because they're questions that make the individual think outside of the current realities. So it enables them and invites them to extend their thinking beyond. The first question is, what are the 2 or 3 major challenges or opportunities you expect to face in the next, pick your time frame. Mm-hmm. It used to be 5 years, then it was 3 years, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year. That really depends upon the pace of change that's occurring within the industry, profession, or cause that the association's engaged with. The second of those open-ended questions is there a problem that you expect to have that you don't know where you're going to get any help from? Now, that begins to develop a menu for the associations of places where they can consider the possibility of useful responses that will differentiate them from other places. The third question, which is always one of my favorites, is if there was a program or service that someone could offer that you would pay for no matter what, depending upon assuming reasonable cost, what would it be? So you get the answer to what the program or service would be, mm-hmm. But if you think through that, you're actually identifying almost at an emotional level what that individual considers to be the primary issue facing the association, and or by extending through that, the primary issue he or she believes that their members are facing. So those 3 questions are the kind of question that Robin referred to earlier, where you're creating the opportunity for true conversation and not just engaged in a telephone survey disguised as a discussion. Robin, what would you say those questions are?
It's really interesting that each of us has a different perspective on this. And I think that I've always agreed with you on those questions, Glenn. But in this particular circumstance, I'm asking questions in 3 areas. The first area is priorities. Given where we are right now and what we've experienced, what are your priorities for your organization? And what are the priorities for us in responding to help you? The second is, given where we are and what we've been experiencing, what are the implications for the future? For you and for the association, what are the implications? And the third area of questions, and each of these can be multiple questions, of course, but the other area of questions would be, what are the potential scenarios that we need to keep in mind and prepare for as we plan for the future? So priorities, implications, and scenarios are 3 big question areas that I really think we should focus on right now for this particular situation.
So I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. When someone says, well, what do you mean by scenario? How do you explain that to them?
Potential futures. So any possible outcomes, if you think about directions at things that could potentially happen. Will telemedicine be the future for family physicians or for veterinarians? Will telemedicine be the way we go? Or is it possible that there will be some other service, such as the drive-by services, like my veterinarian has a valet service, or which I find really amusing, but or is it another scenario where we're going to have to respond? Are there any number of different possibilities or future outcomes? And I think I remember when after 9/11, you remember the government called all those Hollywood script writers from Hollywood to think about future scenarios of what could possibly happen. How could the terrorists get us in the future? And it was enlightening. And so the more creative minds you could bring to potential scenarios, the better you can plan for the future, because there are things that can be coming at us that we can't even predict. We can't plan for everything, but we can plan for possible outcomes in certain areas.
So would you agree with my observation and experience that one of the keys to valuable conversations that involve scenarios is good judgment about what are the things that will make tomorrow different depending upon which way they go?
I would never disagree with you, Glenn.
At least not right now. We'll do that later.
But I also want to put a plug in for scenarios, because the role of the association is a neutral party. The association is the place where scenarios should be created, because it is the place where all the parties can come together, both the competitors and the partners, to kind of come together to think about the future. And so it really is, in my opinion, a responsibility of the association to be really thinking through and having the dialogues necessary to create those scenarios for the future. If they don't, who will?
So once you have those scenarios, what do you do with them?
I think it opens up all new possibilities for research. I think that, you can't research everything, but to be truly informed, and as you start to scan the environment, to start organizing your thinking, becomes a knowledge management issue, to start organizing your thinking around potential scenarios so that you collect information. And then again, you're not flying on people's opinions or their guesses, but you actually start to compile verifiable, quantifiable, really true world information to support a scenario or to disprove a potential scenario or to help to respond to a scenario. And so then the scenarios, again, have to go hand in hand with a knowledge management system.
So then the research allows us to be prepared for whatever reality becomes the eventual reality. So we have ahead of time the then that's that go with the if this.
Then. Yeah.
And I would observe that one of the values of the research initiative, and it's a subtle one, but a real one, particularly a value to CEOs, is that it demonstrates to your members that the association can be a partner in enabling you to continue to exercise some control over your own destiny. Even where you cannot control what ultimately the scenario will be that becomes the reality, you do always have the opportunity to influence your future by virtue of how you choose to respond to that new reality. And by providing that thoughtful possibility, that set of thoughtful possibilities, I think you are not just making a promise of the value of the association, but at that moment delivering it by allowing the association to demonstrate to its members that it is in fact working to assist them to be able to continue to exercise some control over their own destiny. And when we talk with folks about, well, what truly is your anxiety now? What truly do you fear? And you peel away all the levels of the onion, what we are hearing, and others as well, is they are afraid of what they don't know.
Right.
They're afraid of a loss of control. And to the extent that you can be responsive to that fear, I think in and of itself, you are providing value to the membership.
I have to just butt into here and say, this is why I wanted to do this interview with these people. When we get together and have our consultant meetings, these 1 hour meetings become 2 hours, and they're so good. They're so good, and they could go on forever. But I know that we're limited on time. So I wanted to actually take this moment to say, because it's leading that way naturally anyway. As I started out at the top of the hour by saying, this is essential. These are essential conversations. That's what this series is all about. This particular episode was focused primarily on asking the questions. What kind of questions do you need to be asking right now? What should you be asking your stakeholders right now? And I hope that you've gotten an answer, a really great answer to that particular question. But as we look to what happens next, once you get those questions answered, what then do you do with those answers? What is that next step? And that is where we were naturally headed. That's where we're headed for the next episode. And so I would just ask my panelists today, as we take that next step, as we begin to receive the answers back from these high quality, excellent conversations that we have, and asking the questions that most need to be asked right now. What is that next step? Where are we headed next? Somebody want to sum it up for me?
Well, I'll try by referring back to an observation that Robin made earlier. Paul and Robin and I always disagree. In fact, we cherish those disagreements, because out of the confrontation of those perspectives and ideas, we have found that it's much more likely the truth will be uncovered.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So
specifically, we know that associations do certain things really well, and there are other things that they don't do, they shouldn't do. And so, the follow-up to the information we get is the obvious question of, what does this mean for our advocacy agenda? What does this mean for our future research agenda? What does this mean for our education agenda, our content agenda, our content strategy? So, and it's really making sure that we're balancing between reacting to what's going on and shaping the future. So if I were to have a conversation as a staff about this information, I would say, where do we need to react? And what do we need to, in advocacy, for example, and where do we need to begin to shape? Where do we need to react to what's going on in education? And that reaction could be immediate, or it could be longer term. And where do we begin to think about how we begin to shape the future with our education? Now, in every organization, the balance between shaping and reacting is going to be different. So we don't want to be, we're not saying that everything should be about shaping, but it is really about the right balance based on what's going on in the lives of the members.
Finding where the cursor on the continuum between the aspirational and the actionable needs to land at a particular point in time.
Right.
And being sufficiently nimble to move that cursor on the continuum as these rapidly as the context changes as rapidly as it has been.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. Thank you so much for sticking with me a little bit over time, just a little bit, and just 1 minute. But thanks to all of you who tuned in live. Those of you who listened a little bit later, you missed out on being able to ask your questions live. But I really appreciate you tuning in for these essential conversations, finding out what questions you need to ask. And you need to keep asking those questions every day, because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. So with that, have a great rest of the week, everyone. Go to Tecker.com for more information about each of our panelists today. If you want to read blogs and see books that you can order and ask for more information, you can do that through Tecker.com. And I look forward to seeing everyone hopefully on Thursday, when we're going to have another episode, an interview called This or That, talking to association executives about why they've chosen the virtual meeting platforms they have and the results that they've gotten from those. So please register for that if you haven't already. And I hope you have a great rest of the week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kiki.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Kate.